This episode of Navel Gazing is sponsored by valleygivesback.org. Adding a Valley charity to your estate plan creates a lasting legacy that tells future generations what causes matter to you. Your action will inspire others to follow your lead and make a difference. With a planned gift, you have the power to impact the Valley community forever without affecting your current lifestyle. Learn more at valleygivesback.org, an initiative of the Valley Community Foundation. Plan now, give later, and impact tomorrow at valleygivesback.org.
For hundreds of years we've brought you the news. Printed the info, we gave you the clues. Owners' profits were always sky high. Changing market now threatens our lives. Post-literation, critical reading, dumbed down nation, signs of inbreeding. TV sucking ideas from our head. Public discourse just about dead. We'll ride the dinosaur. Yeah, ride the dinosaur. Our readers are in the opens each day. Online clickbait a prurient way.
Hey everybody, welcome to Navel Gazing, the Valley Indy Podcast. My name is Eugene Driscoll of valleyindy.org. You can follow this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. You can also follow the Valley Indy on Twitter at Valley Indy, Facebook.com/Valley Independent Sentinel. Our guest today is Joseph Jaumann. He is a candidate for the State House of Representatives. Conducting the interview will be Mr. Ethan Fry, the valleyindy.org reporter. Mr. Jaumann, welcome to the show.
Morning. Thank you for having me.
Welcome back, because you ran a couple of years back, and we did this once before.
We have.
Hello, Ethan. How are you?
Good morning. Good. How are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
In the news this morning, good morning. And yeah, Eugene will be popping in with follow-ups, I think, throughout the interview.
And making sure that the mics
something
work.
Slips by me. So thanks again, Joe, for coming in. First of all, you were one of the primary forces behind the Ansonia and Derby School Regionalization Committee. The committee's, you're a member of it.
Yes, sir.
And it's studying whether regionalizing could save money without hurting education. Yet Mayor Cassetti has already reached a conclusion, it seems, when he says that he appointed you and the others representing Ansonia because you're in favor of regionalization like he is. This was brought up by a member of the committee at its last meeting. So how can people trust that the committee's work isn't biased, that you guys haven't already reached a conclusion?
Well, I think Tara's point was regarding whether or not there can be actual savings realized.
That's Tara Hyder, the member of the
yes.
committee I referenced.
And I understand that, and I agree with her comments that it's a bit premature to, go out and say we're going to be able to reach this conclusion or that conclusion. I think the idea behind the regionalization committee is first to study whether or not we can find those efficiencies to be able to deliver the same quality of education or a higher quality of education at a lower price. And that's really what the temporary regionalization study committee is all about, is looking at those things, trying to gather as much information as possible, looking at, and delving into all the nuances between the two districts. I know there's some hurdles that we have to delve into and deal with, and I'm sure we will when the time comes, but we have 2 years. It's going to be a long study. And I think at the end of the day, I'm hopeful anyway, that we're going to come up with some ways, if not true regionalization in the sense where it's going to go out to referendum. We can utilize some shared services, bulk purchasing, so we can find better ways for our schools to be more efficient.
And as you mentioned, like if there's recommendations for regionalization, it'll be put to voters in both Ansonia and Derby. They would have to approve it.
That's correct. I mean, the way the process works is, there's we've now formed, both Board of Aldermen approved a temporary regionalization study committee. That committee has now been formed. We've had our first 3 meetings, I think, at this point in time. We're going to be looking into retaining a consultant that will assist us with drafting a report, looking into various different things and gathering information. And once we have been able to do that, my anticipation is that there's going to be certain subcommittees to look into different aspects and including, facilities, dealing with administration, what truly where the things are, where there can be some efficiencies and whatnot. And once that is done, there'll be a recommendation. It's actually about feasibility, as what the statute says, as to whether or not regionalization is feasible within the communities. And at that point in time, the recommendation will be pro or con towards feasibility with regards to regionalization. It would go to the State Board of Education. They would have the opportunity to review it, agree with the conclusion or disagree with the conclusion. If they agree, at that point in time, it would go out to referendum, I believe, within 45 days of their recommendation. So the voters would actually have the last say.
And one thing I've just heard in comments from people on online and in person, in talking about that whole issue of regionalization, is they point to the lawsuit between the Ansonia Board of Education and City Hall over the alderman cutting $600,000 from the Board of Education's budget in January. And they say, look, Ansonia just among themselves, they're suing each other. It seems like every day there's another strongly worded letter between lawyers on each side. Is that like a mark against that regionalization effort? How is that going to be resolved, do you think? Will it take a trial to have a judge?
I think like Derby's concern that's been voiced is that, well, if Ansonia can't get along with each other, how are they going to get along with us?
I mean, I don't, with regards, two questions there, really. I mean, first, with regards to the litigation, I understand that there's motions that are scheduled for in November, motions for summary judgment, which will be decided on the merits of what the in particular claim is, rather. And with regards to the issue as to whether or not it affects regionalization, I don't think so. I mean, sure. I mean, there's issues. There's issues between every administration and school board. I think there's always tension there between funding and whether or not it's adequate. I think that's something that just the nature of the process, whether or not the Board of Educations in each town have enough money, or whether or not their request was met, or depending on each particular town. I think there's always that sort of built-in tension between the two.
But this one's gone beyond that, where you have the school district suing the city, and then daily lawyer-written briefs attacking each other at this point. Do you think that the relationship there is broken? It is able to be repaired? Can anybody just get in a room and sort of work out the differences? Because it seems to go beyond the annual "you don't give us enough money" argument.
Well, I would agree with that, but I mean, specifically with regards to regionalization, I don't think it's affecting the regionalization committee. I think those meetings have been sort of frank and positive in an effort to try to see if there is if there is that efficiency pertaining to the question of regionalization. As to whether or not that relationship can be mended, I think it can be. I think it's going to take people coming together at some point in time and having a discussion. I think the legal question is going to be dealt with in court, and after that, I think the parties will get together and see if there's something that can be done.
And we should mention that Mr. Jaumann is running for the 104th State House of Representative District. That is the seat that is currently held by Linda Gentile, who is retiring after years of service to the lower Naugatuck Valley.
And Ansonia and part of Derby, the district represents. There's a primary happening the day we're recording this and hopefully releasing it. Who are you voting for in the Republican primary for governor, and why?
Tim Herbst. I think he has what it takes to really come into Hartford and turn things around. So I've been supportive of Tim. I've known Tim for a while. I like his stance with regards to reducing business regulations and really trying to make sure that the taxpayers' burdens are reduced.
And any standout endorsements in the under-ticket races? I mean, there's like a bunch of people running.
Sue Hatfield, big fan. Okay. I've known her for a long time.
Okay.
I knew her in practice. I've actually had cases with her. So big fan of Sue. I think her stances on most of the issues are right on. So.
And then I don't know, like when you said herps, like this just springs to mind. Like we shared a letter to the editor on our Facebook page endorsing herps last week, and the comments were just flooded with people saying like, "I'm from Trumbull, I'm a Republican, I hate herps, you raise taxes, et cetera, et cetera." Have you heard any of that sort of pushback? Talking to other Republicans, or
I think it's a 5-way horse race, and everybody's sort of barking and at everybody. The keyboard warriors are alive and well on Facebook, commenting on everything. So I think, it's when you have a 5-way primary, you have a lot of people vying for every vote they can possibly get, and I think it's a horse race between Mark Boughton and Tim Herbst at this point in time. I think those are the two front runners, and I think ultimately one of them is going to be the Republican nominee tonight.
Will you support Boughton if he wins?
I'll support the candidate that comes out of the primary. Absolutely.
All right. There's no candidate you'd never support, or like whoever the voters decide.
I would agree with that. I mean, okay. It's about going into Hartford. There needs to be a change. Our state has really been going in the wrong direction for a long time. I said this in our podcast in 2016. I think we need to be more focused on relieving the taxpayers of their burdens, relieving businesses of their burdens, and making sure that, people want to stay here. I mean, in a recent Sacred Heart poll, I mean, the top two issues are taxes and the high cost of living. And we have to reduce both of those things in order to maintain the and make people want to stay here in Connecticut. So.
You're an attorney who often defends people accused of crimes, so we'd like to hear your take on this. According to the New York Times, in June, President Trump said that those who cross into the U.S. illegally should be sent back immediately without due process or an appearance before a judge. Do you agree?
I think immigration is a federal issue. I don't think that is something that impacts the state. I mean, with regards to my opinions, I think I have represented many people who have not been American citizens. So I will say this, is that when you are accused of a crime, I guess from my perspective it's difficult to defend a person who is not from this country knowing that there's going to be an ICE detainer levied on them and they're going to be sent back. I believe in due process. I believe a person should have the right to at least make a claim before an immigration judge as to whether or not they have a valid reason for crossing the border, whether or not it's political asylum or whatnot, to try to stay in this country. So,
and then you mentioned it's a federal issue, but there have been stories this year about agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement detaining illegal immigrants at state courthouses in Bridgeport, New Haven. So it sort of dovetails. Like, do you support those actions? Do you think they could hamper criminal investigations when you have is there a chilling effect that immigrants could feel about, coming forward to report crimes, things like that?
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I think that it's one of those issues where it certainly has a chilling effect, makes people not want to show up to court, whether or not they're a defendant or a victim, if they think there's an ICE agent. I mean, I've heard those rumors too. I'm in the courthouses pretty much daily. I've never seen an ICE agent other than on official business coming there for a particular detainer or trying to pick somebody up. So I can't speak to whether or not that's actually a reality because I haven't seen it personally.
And then just on this last one on this issue, do you think the so-called sanctuary cities such as New Haven should lose federal funding?
I think that if you are going to violate federal law and refuse to adhere to it, I think at that point in time there should be some penalty. So I don't support, I understand if you want to change federal law. I understand if you want to change federal immigration policy. I think there should be a pathway to citizenship for people that are already here. But to have mayors around the country trying to defy federal law and saying we're not going to cooperate with the federal government, I think it's problematic. So I do think that there should be some penalty for that.
And I have just a quick follow-up. Do you see illegal immigration as a problem in Ansonia or Derby?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure there are people that are undocumented living here in the Valley, living in Ansonia and living in Derby. Do I think it's a problem where it's running rampant? I don't believe so.
Okay, this a 2016 survey of Connecticut businesses, this is from the Yankee Institute, by the way, showed that 79% of respondents said business costs from government regulations and mandates other than taxes hampered their firm's ability to grow? What are some of the government regulations that can make it tough to do business here?
Hi, this is Eugene Driscoll, most likely interrupting myself to bring you a message from our sponsor, valleygivesback.org. Adding a Valley charity to your estate plan creates a lasting legacy that tells future generations what causes mattered to you. Your action will inspire others to follow your lead and make a difference. With a planned gift, you have the power to impact the Valley community forever without affecting your current lifestyle. Learn more at valleygivesback.org, an initiative of the Valley Community Foundation. Plan now, give later, impact tomorrow at valleygivesback.org.
Well, I mean, for one, the business entity tax. We pay a business entity tax just for existing at this point in time when that paperwork can be filed. I mean, we have high costs for filing paperwork. I mean, when you have to consult an attorney before you can open a business, it leads to, high costs of just even starting a business, and it hampers, people's ability to actually do it. If you want to be an entrepreneur and start a business, I mean, you should have the ability to get into the marketplace without being, having to dish out $2,000 to $5,000 to make sure you can be in that position to actually go to the marketplace. So I would agree. I think if that poll was taken in 2018, I think you'd actually have higher. It would actually be a higher percentage. So.
And what about like some of Governor Malloy's efforts over the last couple of years? The Fast Five initiative got a ton of press.
Government welfare, though.
Excuse me. I'm sorry. I coughed on your answer.
That's all right. Government welfare. I don't think that the government should be handing out money to businesses. If you want to offset it by agreeing to not implement or to have a reduced tax or doing things like that over the course of a period of time, I think that's fair. You give businesses the opportunity to move here, to Connecticut or to a particular town or municipality, and you offset some of those upstart costs by reducing the tax burden over a 5-year period, over an 8-year period. I'm all in favor of that. But when you start actually taking taxpayer dollars and handing out $3, $5, $10 million to try to keep large corporations so that they can meet certain obligations, and they're promising to, hire 2,000 people, and then immediately after receiving that, and 2 years later, those people are being laid off because the company has taken the tax dollars and run with it. I just don't think that's good policy.
Didn't the city do that with Farrell, though? They said, we'll pay this $1 million to build a road into the Fountain Lake Commerce Park to basically, like Farrell was saying, that they would go to Oxford if that didn't happen.
Well, that was a conjunction. I think that the municipality worked with the state and I believe the federal government in trying to get that road built, and that was for infrastructure. And I'm okay and building infrastructure to have businesses come in, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Fast Five or the Fab Five, Fast Five, whatever it was called, and that is specifically giving money to large corporations and giving them and telling them that they have to hire 500 people, 200 people, with the promise of $5, $10, $2 million, whatever the incentive is to have them do that. It's a little bit different. If you're planning for the long term, that road was built up at Fountain Lake, not just for Farrell necessarily, but for also the other sites up there to be available to other developers.
And if you're elected, what are some business-friendly laws or bills or initiatives, tax incentives that could specifically get businesses to economically development-starved Ansonia and Derby? What are the biggest stumbling blocks, and what can the state do to help? Or state lawmakers, I mean.
Small businesses, let's reduce the entry costs. Let's reduce the business entity tax. Let's reduce how much it costs to file to open an LLC. Let's make it more user-friendly. Let's make it more online so that these things can be filed quickly. Startup costs are low, and allowing those small business owners. In terms of larger businesses, I think that the economic development that Ansonia is doing is kind of the right track. That's exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be working with cooperative. The mayor announced last night, working at Copper and Brass, trying to retain an economic development corporation under the new statute that was just passed with regards to a land bank, which is basically another cooperative where the state, local government, as well as a private development corporation can come in, take possession. It reduces a lot of the liability on the private company, but they can then try to remediate utilizing federal, state dollars, state grants to try to remediate a lot of the contamination and environmental problems, making that property get back to market faster.
Is that sort of Ansonia's biggest hurdle, and I guess Derby to some extent? You've got contamination in these old factories, and nobody wants to foot that bill.
Yeah, I think it is. We talked about that in our 2016 podcast a little bit, talking about, at that point in time, I was in favor of the legislation for the land banks, and it finally passed. I know Representative Gentile was very supportive of that as well. I don't think that's necessarily a partisan issue. I think recognizing that a lot of these old communities in the Valley and other places have old factories that need to be remediated and dealt with for environmental contamination and whatnot. And I think clearing a path to allow an economic development corporation to come in and reduce their liability in terms of the environmental contamination, and allowing investors to come in and put money into that and to receive federal monies in terms of grants and state monies in terms of grants. I think that is the way to get these properties, a lot of them, back on the tax rolls.
Another one about the state economy. Do you think public sector unions are crippling the economy? Should we reopen state employee contracts to rein in long-term pension and benefits liabilities?
I think there's a high cost. They're estimating in this next biennium budget that there's going to be 50% fixed costs, and that is in terms of how much money has been bonded to date, as well as the continued and rising costs of the state union contracts. I don't take the stance that other Republicans have taken. I think that there's certain promises that were made to employees that were there, knowing the tier system. And I'm not familiar with all of the nuances, but I understand that certain promises were made, and people that have been on the job for 25 years have certain expectations of what their pensions are going to look like. And I think you have to do your best to honor those agreements. At the same time, I think there's a certain reality that you have to face, is that if the state's fixed costs continue to rise at the rate they're going, we're not going to be able to pay for anything else. So I think everybody sort of has to go into the situation with open eyes and sit down and say, hey, how can we fix this together, working together? I think people are really tired of the bickering back and forth about a lot of this stuff, and I think they need people that are going to roll up their sleeves and get to work.
And that brings me back to the situation happening in Ansonia between the Board of Aldermen, or Mayor Cassetti's administration, and the Board of Education and the Superintendent's office. Where what have you done to sort of roll up your sleeves and try to tackle that problem to resolve it? Like I said before, there has been a lot of back and forth, and maybe people on the local level are growing tired of the of the animosity there.
Well, I don't really want to speak to any of the pending litigation, but what I can say beforehand is that there was meetings that took place in January and March of this year with the Board of Education, both myself and Alderman Stowe as co-chairs of the Education Subcommittee for the Board of Aldermen, trying to work with them towards shared services, regionalization. We had some fruitful conversations. We actually interviewed a couple of consultants at one point in time, specifically with regards to regionalization and where we were going to go with that, but also more so on the shared services side. I know that in talking to the mayor's office, they're very open to working towards shared services with the Board of Education. If we could have that conversation, we had it in March. I think everybody would be more than happy to have it again. It's just a matter of sitting down and getting the parties to do that. There's been a lot of animosity thrown back and forth. So, unfortunately, I think people want to get everybody in a room and talk, and I think that there's more than enough people on both sides that are willing to do that, but it's just a matter of, having the legal questions decided first, I think, before you can really get to that point.
Yeah, and I guess the state education department has said several times that, we're getting really into the weeds locally, but they've said several times that the Board of Aldermen were not authorized to take that $600,000 away. And you may be repeating yourself, but do you support, you voted to remove that money. Is that correct? Because I don't cover
In January and then again in June.
Okay.
The vote took place twice.
And then what's your, how do you explain, or how do you, I don't want to say defend, but how do you defend that move?
Well, I mean, it's pending litigation, so it's tough to, I can just give you sort of my background.
The vote, I mean, it's
a
public
with
record.
Regards to, I think the Public Act, particularly Section 266, speaks directly to that. I mean, I think the
And
city
explain what that is for people who don't
it basically authorized,
code.
because, we were put in this position. I think a little backdrop's probably necessary. But unfortunately, last year, the state budget was not passed until very, very late, leading to this sort of problem. At the time, we, as a board of aldermen, and having been a member of the finance committee at that point in time, had a lot of discussions about where we were going and what we were going to do with regards to the municipal budget, knowing that there likely was not going to be a state budget that was passed. So we had no idea what we were going to be receiving in municipal aid. We had no idea what we were going to be receiving. Discussions with the Board of Education with regards to what their budget request was at that point in time. They did not believe that they were going to be receiving any grants, the Alliance grant specifically, which led to a lot of collaboration by both parties. And I would say I think we've worked very well on that Finance Committee with the Board of Education, trying to realize what their ask was, what their minimum was, to make sure that they could keep all of the services in place. And ultimately, we decided to vote on a budget as a Board of Aldermen that was what we believe the worst case scenario under where we were with the state, and not knowing what the state was. Fast forward about 4 months later, when the state finally got around to passing a budget, and we actually received this. The Board of Education received their Alliance grant money. They received additional monies as well, I believe.
And the Alliance, for anybody who doesn't know, Alliance District money is extra cash from the government because your schools are very low performing.
Correct. Yes. And at that point in time, the discussion was had during the Finance Committee meeting. The discussion was had at our Board of Aldermen meeting in June, I believe, of 2017. That when and if the state did pass their budget and the Alliance grant money was there, we would take a look back at the budget depending on what the circumstances were. The Public Act passed that allowed the municipalities to take a look at them and to reopen their budgets if necessary to adjust. And that's what we did in January. So that kind of leads up to it.
The other side is saying you can't do that because it's Alliance District and has special attachments that prevent you from doing so.
They said like the state law that allows the towns to go back into their budget specifically mentions Alliance districts. I mean, there's a dispute over, where like
one section mentions it
lawsuit,
and the other section doesn't.
And let's talk politically now, because I would think that if I was your opponent or a member of the Democratic Party trying to win the seat for which you're running, I would say, well, you're anti-education. You're not giving that. You have the school district and the professionals saying we need this money to do what we need to do, which is to educate the children. And instead, we're laying off teachers, and we're in a screaming match with the Cassetti administration every day. How would you respond to that? A flyer that said Jaumann anti-education.
I don't think that's the case. I think my track record shows, trying to promote regionalization, trying to find better efficiencies and quality, promoting it through regionalization, shared services. I mean, I was on this podcast in 2016 talking about how I think the state has done a poor job in funding ECS dollars and coming back. I mean, the reality is that I've never heard a Board of Education say they don't need more money. So at the end of the day, there's always that, like I said earlier, between municipalities and boards of education, there's always that stress as to whether or not it's enough, it's not enough. Ultimately, it's you have to look out for the taxpayers when you're sitting on the Board of Aldermen.
Do you think, and this is my last question on this topic,
Sure.
Because it might not be of interest to statewide, but would you support the removal, or do you think there should be a change at the top of the school side? Should the superintendent position, should someone else be in there at this point?
That's up to the Board of Education. I'm not going to get into their politics. That's up to them. I understand at a recent meeting, I think they just extended some contracts. I know the superintendent may have been one of them. I'm not sure. I wasn't at the meeting. So
there's a petition that went around calling for her to be removed. If somebody knocked on your door and asked you to sign that, would you sign it?
I haven't yet. Again, I think that's
Were you
one of
asked?
those. I was not. But I mean, that's one of those things. I think that's up to the Board of Education ultimately. We had a petition presented to us, and I don't think that's a job for a member of the Board of Aldermen to comment as to whether or not the school district's superintendent should be in that job.
And then just really quickly,
Sure.
You mentioned that there's going to be a scheduled hearing in November in this lawsuit, motions
November
for
14th,
summary
actually.
judgment. Do you anticipate a judge, ruling on that? And then, I mean, wouldn't there still be a trial scheduled, and that's not going to happen until October 2019, and all these layoffs and everything, those have already happened by now. So
Procedurally, motions for summary judgment deal with the legal issues. So whether or not if there's no issue of material fact, a court can ultimately reach a decision with regards to this motion for summary judgment. Otherwise, if there are facts in dispute, there would be a trial on the merits. But ultimately, on the legal question, I believe it's November 13th or 14th of this year. I think those motions
So
are
once a
scheduled
judge
for.
makes that ruling, do you anticipate it'd be more of an impetus for the whoever loses that to basically compromise or seek to settle it?
I mean, there's always the losing party can always take an appeal. But I mean, I think at that point in time, I think it's an impetus to get people to the table to try to work things out and come to some reasonable compromise ultimately.
Okay, and as you said, you were here 2 years ago, and you will have answered a lot of these questions. But for people who didn't listen back then, just some background: where were you born and raised? What did your parents do? Education, siblings, family.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Grew up in a town called Mahopac, New York. Came here for law school. Went to Quinnipiac. Moved down to D.C. briefly, where I met my wife. Moved back to Ansonia. Moved to Ansonia roughly late 2004. Been here ever since. I'm an attorney by trade. I own a small practice, Joseph Jaumann, down in Bridgeport. It's myself, a partner, and 3 associates, and some support staff. I'm the oldest of 5. I have 2 brothers, 2 sisters. My father was the director of global data telecommunications with Seagram's in New York, and then Eli Lilly out in Indiana for a while. They've both since retired, or my mother's on the verge of retiring. She does payroll for a company here in Connecticut, but they both reside in Ansonia.
And how long have you been a Republican, and what made you choose the Republican Party?
We talked a little bit about this in 2016. I registered as a Republican. I believe it was late 2015. And I think it's just where the state has gone. I find myself agreeing more and more with Republican policies and, sustainability and predictability. I think that's what it's all about. I think the Democratic majority in Hartford has done a terrible job raising taxes and really making and driving up the cost of living here in the state. And I think we need more people that are going to go to Hartford and fight against that.
And then I guess, and I probably asked this a couple of years ago too, but I'll just ask again. Are you Republican enough for the Republican Naugatuck Valley? If I am now, you hear them called Trump Republicans. Some of the things you said about illegal immigration might not work or might not be seen as favorably from sort of a hardcore Trump Republican. My words. But you ran previously.
Yep.
What is your take on that? Because I mean, in the governor's primary, we've heard like Mayor Boughton isn't Republican enough. So if somebody hit you with that tag, Joe, you're late to the Republican Party.
I'm the Republican nominee. So if I'm not Republican enough for it, then I think the Republicans should, I guess wouldn't have given me the endorsement. I look at it like that. So, I mean, you asked me how I would label myself in 2016. I said I'm pretty independent. I think of myself that. I think good ideas come from both sides of the aisle. I don't necessarily agree with all of the platforms the Republican Party has. I certainly don't agree with all of the platforms the Democratic Party has. I think people can come together and work towards an issue. I mean, regionalization, going back there really quickly, I worked with Representative Gentile with regards to that. She's supportive of doing this study and determining its feasibility. So am I. I think anybody that looks at this issue and just realizes, look, this is the future. We have to, studying something doesn't necessarily mean you support it. I can't say right now as I sit here that I'm going to be 100% in favor of regionalization because I don't know what it looks like. But I think, working together with people and having an open mind and recognizing that, look, just because it's a democratic idea doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I mean, Ned Lamont went on at the gubernatorial debate the other night, said that, commended Derby and Ansonia for their regionalization efforts. So, I think that's.
I didn't realize that. I missed that.
I didn't watch that.
Thanks, Ned.
I just saw the thing about
thanks,
him.
Ned. I appreciate it.
Wouldn't support Ganem. But
this is interesting. Are you going to go to the partisanship?
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned partisanship, and then just hyper locally with respect to that, you're a member of Team Cassetti, quote unquote. Yet a lot of Ansonia Republicans say the mayor and his team are bullies, like Alderman Phil Tripp, one of your colleagues on the Board of Aldermen, Republican. He's commented publicly that it comes down to, quote, kiss the ring or get the boot. And doesn't it, like the fact that the Republican Town Committee was the longtime chairman was recently ousted in favor of David Papson, a close ally of the mayor, who's now running in a primary against longtime registrar and former mayor Nancy Valentine. Doesn't that lend credence to Tripp's point or argument?
So. I think there's some disgruntled people out there that have their personal animosities, and they try to make it more than it is.
What about going on Ethan's question there? We had the president of the Board of Aldermen, Lori Vaccaro, in here for a podcast about Charter Revision Commission. And towards the end of the podcast, I didn't really think of anything when he said it, but some commenters on Facebook have been pointing out. I basically asked him, on Charter Revision, shouldn't you bring in people who have an opposite point of view to sort of, since it's the city's future and the blueprint for the little mini democracy here, isn't it good to get people from the other side?
And exactly what we did last night.
Well, because he had said, though, that, no, we don't want people who want to take the city backward, sort of indicating, although I didn't ask this as a follow-up, meaning, well, Democrats, we don't need you to take a walk. And isn't that the type of sort of attitude that we see that people are growing sick of, and can he get anything done?
I don't think so, and I don't think that was what Lori's point was, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think it's the mentality that we should go back 10 years to where Ansonia was, and I don't think anybody wants to do that. I think we need people that are going to focus on the task at hand and move things forward. I mean, the mayor last night announced one of his proposals for charter revision would be minority representation on the Board of Aldermen. I think that's a fantastic idea. I mean,
Just explain what that is for people.
Being that there should be not only one, right now we have 14 aldermen. Of those 14, all of them are Republicans. This would allow, with a charter change, to have a certain number of Democrats, whatever that is, as charter revision works through its process, to make sure that the minority party, whoever's not in power with the majority on the Board of Aldermen, would have a voice. And I think that's important. One of my favorite aldermen, Pat Henry, now retired, made that in his departing comments. That was one of Pat's things, that he was a very big proponent of minority representation and making sure that everybody has a voice. And I think that's very important. I agree with the mayor. I agree with Pat. And I think that was probably more to Lori's point.
On another topic, in terms of guns, do you support the law that made ownership of bump stocks a felony in Connecticut?
I don't.
Any reason that you'd like to?
Pro Second Amendment. I believe, I received the CCDL endorsement in 2016. I'm hopeful to receive it again in 2018. I just think that as you continue to impede unlawful gun ownership, I don't see the point. I think it violates the Constitution. Even
like the bump stock, which was, I guess, an accessory, not exactly a weapon, but an accessory that made a weapon better, I guess, so to speak. It had full support in the state, from what I saw in the state law.
And I think the NRA supported the bump stock ban, if I'm not mistaken. But it basically makes it like you can't have a fully automatic gun, and the bump stock is a way to try to sort of get around that to make a gun.
Well, I'll just play devil's advocate here. If I'm your opponent or somebody that thinks we need some type of sensible gun control or sensible gun laws, is sort of the phrase that's always used. And they might listen to that statement saying you're against making the ownership of bump stocks a felony. Well, that's gun nut territory. That's too right wing. I just can't live with that. How do you?
I think I would respond like this. I think I said, in 2016 when I was on here, I think legislation should be cool. I think it should be calm, and I think it should be logical and reasonable. And every time we have a quote unquote tragedy, around whether or not it's hyped or it's not. There is knee-jerk legislation that is put on, is proposed, and I just think that you need to take a step back. I think lawmakers should be looking at things from a big picture point of view as opposed to whatever is the issue in the news that day. So, and I think that's my would sort of be my reaction, is that I think that you need to focus on those things. I mean, we have bigger fish to fry here in Connecticut than trying to ban bump stocks. We have an economy that's failing. We have people that are leaving. We have a high tax burden on our citizens, and everybody's complaining about it. So I'm knocking a lot of doors out campaigning, and very few people ask me about bump stocks, but every single person asks me about what are you going to do to reduce the costs on me.
What about did they talk about the Second Amendment? You had mentioned that you've gone to a bunch of and have the endorsement of.
I did. I don't have it right now.
That's the Connecticut carry. Oh, you had it in the previous when you ran against.
In the previous race, yeah.
Okay, and that's the CCDL is the Connecticut carry.
Connecticut Citizens Defense League.
It's a
nonpartisan organization that's pro 2A.
And do you hear that when you knock on doors? Is
Sometimes.
that something that...
I mean, you see the bumper stickers, and you have people that ask you that question if you're endorsed by the CCDL or if you are a member of the CCDL. So.
Do you own weapons yourself?
I do.
And was that like a lifelong thing growing up in Mahopac?
As an adult, no, not in New York.
That's
New York regulations are a lot tougher. But I haven't, since about the age of 19, 20, I don't think I've lived in New York. Came here for law school right after college.
And like that, you mentioned you have to be calm and cool about changing laws and stuff. You hear that sometimes after a mass shooting. It's like, oh, it's too soon to think about it. It's too soon in the heat of the moment. But isn't the counter argument, I guess, is like with the laws we have, it's always too soon because these mass shootings are so frequent.
Maybe we should get serious about addressing mental health in this country and in this state. I mean, what we've seen is that we want to pass more gun regulations, but we don't want to fund mental health, and we need a massive overhaul of our mental health in this state.
Yeah, what do you see as an attorney? I mean, you're a defense attorney primarily.
So I do a lot of criminal defense. I do a lot of DCF defense. I guess you could say I battle the state on an everyday basis.
And what could the state be doing more? I mean, are mental impairments and mental problems something that you're seeing in the people you represent all the time? And what's lacking right now?
Well, I mean,
what would you do to change?
With regards to substance abuse and mental health, as the funding levels go down and as the not-for-profits aren't able to receive as much in state money, you see less and less services available for people that are dealing in the criminal justice system, dealing with DCF issues. I just think that if you're going to try to restrict other people's constitutional rights, you should be out there talking about, okay, what can we do to help people that are dealing with, bipolar disorder or some other mental health issues that are causing them to really be in the system in the first place. So, I mean, I can just speak from my legal career. One of the issues that strikes me is that we really truly need a reform of mental health institutions in this state. I can tell you, having dealt with numerous different cases all over the state, when you deal with what's called a 5456D or a competency hearing, if a client is suffering from serious mental health issues, but he understands that if you commit a crime that's wrong and that a judge is the one that would sentence you to jail, he's competent in the eyes of the law. So what do you do with a person that is schizophrenic? What do you deal with a person that is dealing with serious mood disorders? There's no place for him to go. And if he doesn't have housing, there's no facilities available to him. So you really don't have the ability to help that person like you'd like to do as an advocate. And I've been in that position many times, trying to find beds, find facilities that are willing to take them. And there's just a real lack of it here in the state.
How do you change that? Is there any laws or any, where would I guess you could fund transitional housing or something like that? But how would we do
something
that?
like that? I think, I think that there's got to be, issues with mental health and the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I think they have to be given the opportunity to sort of develop and recognize in the criminal justice system and in the child protection system and in the juvenile delinquency system, there's a lot of people out there suffering from mental health. And as we continue to recognize and identify these people, and we've gotten a lot better at that, but we just don't have the resources thereafter to try to get them back on on track. And I think you need to work with agencies like that and find out what their needs are at this point in time. And I can only tell you as an advocate, wishing they were there, delving into it with, some of these agencies and saying what would allow you to develop these types of things. And maybe it's a matter of privatizing more of these facilities, or allowing, more of this stuff to go out to bid under certain subdivisions of the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. I don't know, but I can tell you Waterbury, Bridgeport, Stamford, Norwalk, Milford, New Haven, there's a severe lack of them throughout the state.
And if I'm somebody who I'm schizophrenic and I commit a crime and you're defending me, and what do they do with me? I mean, do I just get thrown in jail and that's like that's my treatment basically? Is that
essentially you're left with the mercy of the court at that point in time and the discretion of the state's attorney. That's really what it comes down to. You have to do your due diligence as an attorney. Whatever evaluations need to be done, making sure they see the right providers, making sure they see the right doctors that can properly diagnose them, whether or not they're dual diagnosed or not, with substance abuse and mental health, because usually there's a lot of self-medication that leads to the criminal justice system, but just trying to work with those people to find the right fit, and then taking that information, presenting it to the state's attorney, allowing them to hopefully use their discretion, or presenting it to the court in terms of an ultimate sentence.
And with respect to like mass shootings, there's people with mental health issues in every country on earth. I'm pretty sure. Yet mass shootings are extraordinarily rare in every other country except the United States. So are they just so much better at dealing with people with mental health problems, or like doesn't gun control come into it somewhat?
I think lawful gun ownership should not be restricted. It comes down to, if you're going to, we talked a little bit in 2016 about permitting and having a process where people could, if there's mental health issues, there's been a lot of laws that have passed recently. If you feel at this point in time you have to turn in your guns if someone files thinks that you're threatening them, and ask for a hearing before the judge. So, there's a lot of ways to take people's guns away at this point in time already. And we continue to try to restrict that as opposed to dealing with the issue. The issue is mental health.
Should the state income tax be repealed, do you think?
I wish it could be. I don't think I don't know if that's a reasonable and feasible idea at this point in time. I think, as I understand it, about 30 to 38% of all the state revenue comes from the income tax at this point in time. So maybe if there's a plan to phase it out over the long term, but to say that on day one you're going to repeal the income tax, I don't think is realistic.
And I've seen posts that you've made on like Facebook and stuff saying you're against tolls. If tolls don't work, why does every other state in the Northeast have them, including, where Republicans control government? And don't gas taxes fall disproportionately on Connecticut residents, while people from outside the state could just drive through without paying anything for the upkeep of the roads?
Yep, we talked a little bit in 2016 about this as well, and I know you're a big proponent of tolls, Ethan. I'm not necessarily. Let me put it to you this way: I think the issue with tolls is that it's just another tax, and if that's how it's going to be utilized, if you put up tolls close to the borders, you're going to lose about $500 million a year, as I understand it, in federal aid, federal transportation dollars. So you have to be those tolls have to be generating more than that. So, and we already have the 7th highest gas tax in the country. So are we talking about reducing the gas tax? I don't think we are. We're talking about just another tax and implementing tolls. We have a transportation lockbox amendment that's going to be on the ballot this November. I support that wholeheartedly. I think it should be tougher. I don't think it's enough. I don't think the General Assembly should be raiding the transportation fund. I think it should be solely dedicated for that. But the idea of tolls is that if you're going to be offsetting that by reducing other tax burdens, okay, well, now we can have a conversation. But I haven't heard a single person say that. Not Democrat. I'm not a gubernatorial candidate, so
And then we're coming up on time, but just quickly, you mentioned that Sacred Heart poll talking about people saying that, they're going to leave the state and it's hard to do business in the state. The same poll found majority support for legalizing marijuana. Do you support that as well?
Not as a revenue mechanism. I think at this point in time, I'm pretty independent. I tend to lean libertarian with regards to certain social issues, and say, just let's get the government out of our business. I'm for all the good government we can afford. And the problem in this state is that we can't afford much more, and we can't allow government to continue to grow. So if we're going to legalize marijuana and use that strictly as a revenue source, no, I don't necessarily think I'd be in favor of it.
What if it was a break-even proposition?
Well, if we just legalized it and didn't tax it, would that be okay?
Just decriminalize it?
Well, it has been decriminalized, but legalizing it for recreational use.
Well, it's decriminalized to an extent. It's still considered an infraction.
Yeah.
So, at that point in time, if we're going to just say, well, you're still dealing with a federal issue. It's still classified by the feds as a narcotic. Why, I don't really understand. But at the same time, I think that if we're trying to do it at this point in time, and all of the proposals in the legislature the last session were for essentially as a revenue generating tool, and that's not how you're going to get Connecticut back on track. If you want to just repeal the laws that say that marijuana is illegal, well, there's a thought. But
you're not supporting that. You'd consider voting in favor of that.
Okay. I think that I have to do a little bit more research on it, but
What about for medicinal purposes and what do they call those things? Distributors, whatever they're...
Dispensaries.
And
production facilities.
I'm all for
being researched in Ansonia, actually.
Medical research.
That's something that's happening here in the city as we...
And I am all for that. I think it is whatever medical advances we can make from whatever source, I think we should be looking into that.
And then $15 minimum wage. What's your position on that?
I don't think a minimum wage benefits businesses. I think that it actually hurts businesses. What we're going to do is we continue to, increase the minimum wage. We're hurting small business owners. We're hurting taxpayers because ultimately, as businesses have to pay more for one particular employee, they're going to end up automating or doing other things that are going to ultimately lead to less jobs in the economy. So I would not support that at this time.
And then I guess we ran a little bit long, for which I apologize. But to close it out, why don't we just turn the floor over to you, and you can talk about where people can find out more information about your campaign, and then just basically why you're running, I suppose, although feel free to take a minute to say whatever you want.
Okay. I have a website, Jaumann 2018, Jaumann 2018.com. I'm also available on Facebook at that same Jaumann 2018. So they can find me there. There's a lot of posts on Facebook. There's a lot of information on the website already. I'm knocking door to door, leaving palm cards with my phone number on there, my email address. They're available both on, I believe, on the website as well as on Facebook. So people can contact me with any specific questions. I'm happy to answer them. But the reason I'm running is I think just Hartford's going in the wrong direction. I think two largest state tax increases in history have driven a lot of people out of here and made the cost of living here and for businesses just way too high. Taxpayers need some relief. We got to go to Hartford and reduce the burdensome regulations. We got to go to Hartford and we have to reduce the tax burdens on the taxpayers and make this place more business friendly. Connecticut and the Valley in particular, we've done a lot of that in the Valley. Ansonia's had a lot of growth recently, and we need to take that momentum here in Ansonia and bring it to Hartford.
Okay. Mr. Jaumann, I want to thank you for making a return appearance on the Valley Indy Podcast. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Ethan Fry, this is Eugene Driscoll. We'll see you next time.
For hundreds of years we've brought you the news. Printed the info, we gave you the clues. Owners' profits were always sky high. Changing market now threatens our lives. Post-literation, critical reading, dumbed down nation, signs of inbreeding, TV sucking ideas from our head, public discourse just about dead. We'll ride the dinosaur, yeah, ride the dinosaur. readers are in